Hello everyone, and welcome to SCS's webinar on the new version of the FSC Controlled Wood Standard, FSC STD 40-005 version 3. My name is Charles Pope, and I am a Technical Associate and Senior Lead Auditor at SCS. Today's presentation will provide a more in-depth summary of the key revisions or differences between version 2-1 and version 3 of the Controlled Wood Standard. The presentation should only take about an hour and 15 minutes, including time at the end for questions and answers. So let's get started. Here's the outline of today's presentation. We'll start with a review of the effective date, the corresponding transition procedure, and the FSC resources already available. Then we'll enter into a discussion which will highlight the key differences or changes between version 2-1 and version 3 of the FSC Controlled Wood Standard. Most of the discussion will focus on the due diligence system, or DDS, much of which overlaps with 2-1 requirements. However, we'll discuss the introduction of such new requirements as annual internal audits, the risk of mixing with non-eligible inputs in the supply chain, and control measures. During the course of the presentation, we will also provide you with a list of to-do items, which may guide your preparation for your company's transition to the new version. We'll then conclude with a question and answer session. Let's quickly remind ourselves of the effective date and the FSC resources already available. The effective date for version 3 of the FSC Controlled Wood Standard is July 1st, 2016. For both existing and new certificate holders, your next scheduled audit following July 1st may be conducted against either version 2-1 or version 3. However, every certificate holder will need to be audited to version 3 by June 30th, 2017. So if your audit anniversary date is this December, you may either elect to be audited against version 2-1 in December or to be audited to version 3 for the first time. If you elect to be audited to version 2-1, then you will have to schedule an additional audit to version 3 before June 30th, 2017 in order to maintain your certificate in good standing. So what do you need to do? You will need to decide if your next scheduled audit following July 1st will be against version 2-1 or version 3. If you decide to remain certified to version 2-1 in 2016, you will have to coordinate with SCS to schedule your audit to version 3 by June 30th, 2017. It is worth noting that FSC has already developed resources, including webinars and Q&A documents, which go into great detail about the specific requirements of the new standard. You can find those on FSC International's website through a Google search or directly through the link provided on this slide. If you haven't already done so, we highly recommend that you download and review those resources. As a reminder, this webinar is focused on the key revisions for existing certificate holders and is not intended as a complete overview of the standard. Remember also that you can contact your SCS Technical Associate if you have any questions as you absorb and prepare for the new requirements. Okay, let's quickly talk about some of the new terminology introduced with the new standard. Let me first point out that a glossary is found at the beginning of the standard, and it often serves as a valuable resource when you're in doubt. I regularly refer to the glossary for guidance myself. With version 3 of the new standard, co-product is now referred to as byproduct. The definition remains the same, only the term changes. Examples include sawdust and chips produced during lumber processing. Districts of origin are now referred to as supply areas, which are defined as the geographical area from which material is sourced. This is perhaps a bit more intuitive than the previous term. One of the most significant changes to the standard is the inclusion of the term due due diligence system, abbreviated DDS, which is defined as a system of measures and procedures to minimize the risk of sourcing material from unacceptable sources. A company's system of due diligence must include obtaining information and conducting a risk assessment or risk assessments, and may include risk mitigation where necessary. We will discuss this in greater detail later in the presentation. Regarding risk assessments, the glossary has a list of definitions for the various types of risk assessments associated with version 3. These include national risk assessments, or NRAs, centralized national risk assessments, or CNRAs, simplified risk assessments, and extended risk assessments. The simplified risk assessment is currently most relevant to the compliance of certificate holders sourcing non-FSC certified material from the US and Canada. Quoting directly from the glossary, a simplified risk assessment is an organization's assessment of the risk of sourcing from unacceptable sources in unassessed areas, developed according to Annex A of the new standard. Regarding simplified risk assessments, it's important to keep the following in mind. First, simplified risk assessments are conducted by the organization itself. As we will discuss later, this means that the controlled wood risk assessments you are currently using will serve as a strong foundation to meet compliance with the new standards. In this regard, much of your compliance is already met. Second, simplified risk assessments can only be used where an FSC risk assessment, that is, a national risk assessment or centralized national risk assessment, for all 5 controlled wood categories has been scheduled. Both the US and Canadian national offices of the FSC are currently developing national risk assessments, which are scheduled to be completed and approved before December 31st, 2017. Third, simplified risk assessments cannot be used after December 31st, 2017. After this date, simplified risk assessments will need to be replaced either by an approved national risk assessment or centralized national risk assessment, or an extended risk assessment if the national level risk assessment is not approved by then. If you're sourcing non-FSC certified material from an area where an FSC national or centralized national risk assessment has not been scheduled, please contact us for additional information. The terminology used for concluding risk in version 2-1 was low risk or unspecified risk. In version 3, specified risk is the new term used for the situation where, following the completion of a risk assessment, the risk of sourcing material in violation of one or more of the FSC controlled wood categories cannot be concluded as low. The significance of the new term is that specified risk designations are intended to indicate exactly what the risk is and therefore guide the control measures which must be implemented in order to mitigate the risk. Control measures and risk mitigation will be discussed shortly. Sub-suppliers are simply your suppliers working your way back to the origin. In the new standard, there is a stronger emphasis on documenting supply chains and assessing the risk of mixing with non-eligible inputs within the supply chain. These are some of the more salient terms that you will need to be familiar with, which you may put on your list of to-do items. Let me just conclude the slide by pointing out that you are already familiar with most of these terms and definitions. Byproducts, supply areas, simplified risk assessments, and sub-suppliers are just terms that have new names. It's also worth pointing out some of the more prominent exclusions from version 3 of the FSC controlled wood standard. With version 3, the company controlled wood policy, relevant controlled wood training, the purchase and sale of material with an FSC controlled wood claim, and the handling of uncontrolled wood inputs will not be governed by the FSC controlled wood standard. It will still be necessary to meet these requirements, just not through the controlled wood standard. Rather, these requirements will be folded into the main FSC Chain of Custody Standard 40-004. So don't disregard these requirements, as you must continue to demonstrate compliance. They will just be assessed as a component of the Chain of Custody Standard instead of the Controlled Wood Standard. Now we have entered the meat of the presentation, as the changes embedded with the due diligence system will be discussed on the following slides. But before we discuss in detail the DDS of the new Controlled Wood Standard, it's worth providing a little bit of context as it relates to the European Union timber regulation. The EU timber regulation prohibits the placing of illegally harvested timber or timber products on the EU market. This applies to operators who place timber or timber products on the EU market for the first time. The new FSC Controlled Wood Standard adopted the EUTR DDS definitions in an effort to align with the EUTR. However, the EUTR still speaks of negligible risk instead of low risk and specified risk. The intention driving this alignment is that compliance to version 3 of the Controlled Wood Standard can help satisfy EUTR requirements, especially when tracing material back up the supply chain. But please note, however, that compliance with the new FSC Controlled Wood Standard is not officially recognized as meeting EUTR DDS requirements. There is currently no green lane, per se, for certified wood from any certification scheme. Nevertheless, verification through certification may be used in the risk assessment procedure of an EUTR compliant due diligence system. It is also worth noting that the EUTR DDS covers only legislation or legality, while the due diligence system of the new FSC Controlled Wood Standard enables organizations to avoid 5 categories of controversial wood sources. Here we have the table of contents copied directly from version 3 of the standard in order to convey the structure of the standard's requirements. What follows is a discussion of the first section of the DDS requirements, the implementation and maintenance of a due diligence system. It may be helpful to think of these requirements as general or umbrella requirements. Okay, so here's a table of the general requirements of the due diligence system. On the left side of the table, the specific requirements or sections are listed. Additional comments are available and provided on the right side of the table. Some of the major points to emphasize include the need to have, implement, and maintain a documented due diligence system, as well as the need to include all suppliers and sub-suppliers in the DDS. In other words, the entire supply chain back to the supply area must be included in your DDS. If you have a complex supply chain and or source material from areas that cannot be concluded as low risk, you may choose to hire a qualified independent party to assist in the development of your due diligence system. Certificate holders also need to ensure that evidence of conformity is made available for evaluation. Where necessary, certificate holders will have to coordinate with suppliers and or sub-suppliers to provide the necessary evidence of compliance to your own organization, as well as to SCS and ASI, which is the accreditation body for FSC. FSC does not permit certificate holders to apply this standard to forest resources it owns or manages itself, unless the forest is in an area where an FSC NRA or CNRA has been scheduled for completion by December 31st, 2017. Certificate holders are also required to review and revise the due diligence system annually in order to identify changes that affect the relevance, effectiveness, or adequacy of the DDS. This standard notes that stakeholder consultation, field verification, and or document verification may serve as the means to identify such changes. I want to draw your attention to these particular items because they may not only serve as a means to verify the adequacy of your DDS, but they are also potential risk mitigation strategies or control measures, which, as we'll see shortly, are a critical component of the DDS. It should be emphasized here that this represents a key revision to the standard. Also note that the requirements for the implementation and maintenance of a DDS include annual internal audits, which is a new requirement of version 3. But before we move on, I just want to point out that a few of these elements you are already familiar with, as they are existing requirements embedded with the old controlled wood standard or the corresponding directive document. For example, the need to account for the entire supply chain is captured in Advice 05 of the directive document. Also, the exclusion of forest resources owned or managed by the certificate holder is captured in Advice 18. And lastly, certificate holders are already required to revise and adjust their risk assessments annually in accordance with Advice 7. With the new standard, this will just need to be extended to the other components of the DDS. To summarize, these items are the important general requirements for the implementation and maintenance of a due diligence system. While the introduction of annual internal audits and stakeholder consultation, field verification, and/or document verification reflect key differences across the old and new standards, several of the requirements are already familiar to you, which will make your transition to the new standard a little bit easier. Okay, so note that there are 3 distinct components of the due diligence system, each with its own set of requirements: obtaining information, risk assessment, and risk mitigation. The diagram here is copied directly from the standard and illustrates this point. As you continue to learn and absorb the new requirements, you will notice that there is much overlap between version 2-1 and version 3, especially within the DDS components for obtaining information and assessing risk. However, I would just like to draw your attention to the following. First, note that risk mitigation is a new element included in the FSC controlled wood standard. Risk mitigation is achieved through control measures. Second, note the inclusion of supply chains within both the risk assessment and risk mitigation elements of the DDS. While it's not demonstrated on this particular graphic, obtaining information on supply chains is also required in the new standard. And lastly, in order to effectively manage the DDS, version 3 of the FSC controlled wood standard requires annual internal audits. To summarize, mitigating risk, assessing and mitigating the risk of mixing with non-eligible inputs in the supply chain, and instituting an annual internal audit program are new and integral additions to the FSC controlled wood standard. Okay, in order to comply with the general requirements of the due diligence system, you'll need to conduct and document annual internal audits. I have provided this fictitious example of an annual audit record, which includes the information specified or required by the standard. It's intended to serve as a visual aid for this discussion. You'll note that the record includes the audit scope, dates, the staff interviewed, and cases of the DDS evaluated as ineffective, that is, identified nonconformances and opportunities for improvement. Of course, however, each certificate holder may choose the best way to document its own compliance. It's important to emphasize here that you will need to create and maintain records of all DDS requirements, including records of your annual internal audits. Now let's move on to section 2 of the standard, which corresponds to the first big component of the due diligence system, obtaining information on material. table is a summary of the DDS requirements for obtaining information on material. Again, on the left side of the table, the specific requirements or sections are listed. Additional comments are provided on the right side of the table. The first requirement is to obtain, document, and maintain the relevant information on material. The standard itself provides more detail on exactly what information needs to be captured. However, you will note that the information on the origin of material is required to be maintained such that it allows the certificate holder to identify the area with a homogeneous risk designation. Certificate holders may also source material that was previously certified or controlled but lost its status due to a break in the chain of custody, provided that the origin can still be demonstrated to the last certified or controlled status. Note that a key difference with the new controlled wood standard is the need to have access to information on its supply chains, including sub-suppliers, to a level that allows the organization to confirm and document the following: the origin of the material, the risk related to origin, and the risk related to mixing with non-eligible inputs in the supply chain, and risk mitigation strategies. The requirements in the last two bullets will have to be demonstrated in accordance with sections 3 and 4, respectively, of the new standard. Certificate holders will also be required to enforce suppliers to notify them of any changes that affect risk designation or risk mitigation. This may include changes to species, origin, or suppliers, for example. Certain requirements are also required for the sourcing of byproducts and CITES species. Okay, again, let me just point out that several of these requirements you are already familiar with, as they correspond to existing requirements in version 2.1 of the Controlled Wood Standard. For example, maintaining evidence of the origin of material corresponds to section 8.1 of the standard, of the old standard. The requirements associated with sourcing byproducts corresponds to Advice 17 of the directive document. And the requirements associated with CITES species correspond to section 10.1 of the old standard. So these are the more important requirements for obtaining information on material that you should familiarize yourself with. While providing access to information on supply chains represents a key difference across the old and new standards, several of the requirements are already familiar to you and you should not have much difficulty demonstrating compliance. Okay, all certificate holders then will need to obtain and document the required information on controlled material. For version 2.1 of the standard, you are required to maintain an up-to-date list of all your suppliers of wood or wood products that are included in your own controlled wood verification program. The requirements for 5.2 of the old version are listed on the left. These include the names and addresses of suppliers, material description, material quantity, species information as applicable, and purchase documentation. You'll note that the first 5 categories of required information listed on the right side for version 3 of the standard are the exact same. Additionally, for version 3 of the standard, you will need to obtain, document, and maintain the applicable risk assessment, which you already have. You will also need to obtain and document the country of harvest and obtain and maintain evidence of the origin of material. As previously mentioned, the requirement to obtain and maintain evidence of the origin of material is not new to the standard, as it was also a fundamental requirement of the old standard. And lastly, you will need to obtain, document, and maintain information about supply chains. A key point on your to-do list will be to obtain information and document your supply chain or supply chains. Section 2.3 in the new standard mandates that an organization must have access to information on its supply chains to a level that allows it to confirm and document the following: the origin of the material, the risk related to the origin, and the risk related to mixing with non-eligible inputs in the supply chain, and the mitigation of risk. Later in the presentation, we will discuss assessing risk related to the mixing of material along the supply chain. But the critical point here is that you will need to have an understanding of the depth and breadth of your supply chains. And one way to understand your supply chains is to create a supply chain map, or maps. Mapping your various supply chains will not only help you demonstrate the compliance for the information gathering requirements as listed in the previous table, but it will also help you assess the risk of mixing in your supply chain, which is one of the fundamental new requirements of version 3. Now, there is no limit to the length of a supply chain, or there is no limit to the length of a supply chain that can be included in the DDS, but clearly the longer and more complex a supply chain is, the more difficult the implementation of a due diligence system will be. Okay, so let's move on to section 3 of the standard, which corresponds to the second big component of the due diligence system, which is assessing risk. This is one of the most important key differences between version 2-1 of the standard and version 3. As you are already aware, in version 2-1, certificate holders are required to assess the risk of sourcing from any of the 5 unacceptable categories of controlled material at the origin level. But with version 3 of the standard, certificate holders are now required to also assess the risk of mixing controlled material with non-eligible inputs at the supply chain level. This box is also directly copied from the standard, and it's included here in order to emphasize the weight that the new FSC controlled wood standard now places on assessing the risk of mixing in the supply chain. Note that the box indicates that a risk assessment is a thorough look at its supply chain to identify situations, processes, etc. that may result in unacceptable or non-eligible sources entering the supply chains. The box further states that once the risk is assessed, the organization should evaluate how likely and severe the risk may be in order to implement specific control measures to prevent the risk from occurring. Therefore, an examination of potentially risky situations or processes, as well as an evaluation of the likelihood and severity of the risk, for example, may inform your supply chain risk assessment. This table is a summary of the DDS requirements for assessing risk. The first requirement of the risk assessment section dictates that certificate holders use the applicable FSC risk assessment. We'll get into a brief discussion of that in a moment. Certificate holders will also be required to adapt their due diligence systems to new risk assessments approved by the FSC within 6 months. The new standard also requires that risk assessments of unassessed areas be conducted according to Annex A of the standard, with the approval by the certification body. You will also notice that certificate holders will now be required to assess and document the risk of mixing eligible and non-eligible inputs in the supply chain. This, as we've already discussed, is among the most prominent key differences between the old and new standards. If low risk is identified at the origin level and no risk is identified at the supply chain level, then the material may be used or sold as FSC controlled wood. Certificate holders can also use or sell the material as FSC controlled wood if it is demonstrated that no mixing occurred in the supply chain. Lastly, where specified or unspecified risk is identified at the origin level and where any risk is identified at the supply chain level, certificate holders are required to implement risk mitigation strategies or control measures. To summarize, these are the main requirements for the risk assessment part of the due diligence system. and assessing risk in the supply chain represents a critical key difference between the standards. However, as we discussed briefly earlier, and as we will touch on again shortly, much of the requirements for assessing risk at the origin level will not initially require significant changes to your existing risk assessment. Let's talk a little bit now about assessing risk at the origin level. The very first requirement of Section 3 states that the organization shall use the applicable FSC risk assessment to determine the risk related to the origin of the material for each controlled wood category. Initially, this is not going to represent a significant change for North American certificate holders. However, the process of choosing or using the applicable risk assessment may be a bit complicated. As such, we'll have a brief discussion about how to actually choose the applicable risk assessment. This is an image that is also copied directly from the standard. It's found in the glossary or terms and definitions at the beginning of the standard. As you can see, there is a hierarchy of risk assessments. And the main point to take away here is that certificate holders must use the highest listed risk assessment that exists for the supply area. So how do you know what the highest listed risk assessment that exists for the supply area is? The answer is actually found at the FSC risk assessment database online. You can do a simple Google search for the database or simply use the link embedded on this slide. We have also included a screenshot of the database page here. Note that it states that the web page contains information on all FSC risk assessments that are approved, currently under development, or planned for development in 53 countries around the world. In other words, if the country is listed here, it is considered a priority country with a national level risk assessment scheduled. When you get to the database webpage, just click on the country from where you are sourcing controlled material, and the status of that country's risk assessment will display. We won't navigate there now. However, for the United States, I can confirm that a centralized national risk assessment for categories 1 and 5 is available. You may decide to update your risk assessment for categories 1 and 5 with the CNRA content, or wait for the complete national risk assessment for all 5 categories to be approved. So what does that mean? Let's just move down the hierarchy of risk assessments. A national risk assessment developed according to FSC Procedure 60002 version 3 is not available for the United States. A centralized risk assessment is available, but only for categories 1 and 5. Note that a centralized national risk assessment for all 5 categories is required in order for this risk assessment to be applicable. A national risk assessment developed according to FSC Procedure 60002 version 2 is also not available. However, a simplified risk assessment is applicable, as the United States is a priority country for which a national level risk assessment is scheduled. Consequently, the simplified national risk assessment is what applies to certificate holders sourcing controlled material from the United States. As mentioned earlier, you may update your company-owned or simplified risk assessment to include the risk designations and corresponding sources of information from the centralized national risk assessment for categories 1 and 5. Okay, so now we've confirmed that simplified risk assessments are applicable for certificate holders sourcing controlled material from the United States. This table summarizes the requirements of Annex A, which is the part of the new standard that governs simplified risk assessments. This list isn't comprehensive, so I encourage you to review Annex A to understand the full requirements and corresponding details. Note that certificate holders may actually outsource the development of their risk assessment to external bodies with the necessary expertise to assess the relevant risk. Also, certificate holders are required to provide their risk assessment to the certification body and to review it annually. Revisions are required when significant changes to risk become evident. So what we have just covered corresponds to the general provisions outlined in Annex A. What follows are those requirements that specifically correspond to simplified risk assessments. First, note that certificate holders themselves designate risk in simplified risk assessments. I want to reemphasize here that your current risk assessment with some basic modifications can be used as a simplified risk assessment, at least until a national level risk assessment for the U.S. is approved, or until December 31st, 2017, whichever comes first. In other words, until a national level risk assessment is published and approved, certificate holders may develop their own risk assessment at the origin level. In determining risk, certificate holders shall begin at the broadest relevant scale. Most certificate holders sourcing controlled material from the U.S. define the relevant supply areas as states or counties, which are acceptable scales of reference. Also, for Category 3, risk assessments are required to consider the presence of high conservation value areas, such as those identified by the sources listed on the right side of the table for Section 3.3b. Lastly, risk assessments are required to include the relevant sources of information. However, one key difference to note here is the requirement to include risk designations provided on the FSC Global Forest Registry as a base for the risk assessment. While much of your existing risk assessment may still be used and in compliance with the requirements for simplified risk assessments, at the very least, you'll have to update your company-owned risk assessments to include the risk designations provided on the Global Forest Registry. To summarize, these are some of the more notable requirements for use of simplified risk assessments. Let me also be clear and reiterate the fact that these requirements are largely identical to the old controlled wood standard. With the exception of including the Global Forest Registry risk designations, you are already doing all of these things, and as such, initially, you will have a strong foundation for compliance. Okay, here's a screenshot from the Global Forest Registry website, which you are already familiar with. Here we have just pointed out the risk designations on the Global Forest Registry for Category 3 in the United States, which, along with the risk designations for the other categories, will need to be reflected in your updated simplified risk assessment. Okay, for assessing risk then, you will need to conduct and document risk assessments at both the origin level and the supply chain level. As I stated earlier, at the origin level, your current risk assessment may serve as a simplified risk assessment. It is recommended, however, that you update your simplified risk assessment by documenting the date of review, ensuring that your links and citations are active and available, including and citing information on high conservation value ecoregions, and including or citing the FSC US minimum list of applicable laws for use with the controlled wood risk assessment. The minimum list of applicable US laws is found on the right side of this slide and is available upon request from SCS. For the United States, a centralized national risk assessment has been approved for categories 1 and 5. So we also recommend that certificate holders update their risk assessment to match those approved categories. However, it is not required until the national risk assessment for all 5 categories has been approved. Additionally, as we highlighted earlier, you will need to update your simplified risk assessments to include the risk designations provided on the Global Forest Registry as a base for the risk assessment. And lastly, you will need to prepare to transition to either an extended risk assessment or national risk assessment by December 31st, 2017. Now, the reason I mention this is because your simplified risk assessments are likely to continue to compliantly identify low risk across all categories. However, when the final national risk assessment for the United States is approved, there is a possibility that for some identified areas of the country, one or more categories may be found to have specified risk, thereby necessitating the implementation of control measures at the origin level. So in addition to updating your simplified risk assessment, you will also need to develop and document your supply chain risk assessment. The new standard is not prescriptive in how to do that, largely because the FSC recognizes that each certificate holder and its corresponding supply chains are unique. However, you might want to consider some of the following: mapping your supply chains, identifying situations, processes, etc. that may result in unacceptable or non-eligible sources entering the supply chains, including transport, processing, and/or storage as part of the assessment, and evaluating the likelihood and severity of risk. As always, just remember to document your supply chain risk assessment. Now let's move on to section 4 of the standard, which corresponds to the third and last big component of the due diligence system, risk mitigation. Please note that risk mitigation is only required where the result of the risk assessment at the origin and/or supply chain levels does not conclude low or no risk, respectively. In other words, risk mitigation does not apply where all risks at the origin level are concluded as low and where there is no risk of mixing in the supply chain. We mentioned earlier that risk mitigation is achieved through control measures. Similar to the risk assessment requirements, control measures are applicable at both the origin level and the supply chain level. As a reminder, at the origin level, any designation other than low risk merits the implementation of control measures. At the supply chain level, any risk at all merits the implementation of control measures. Also note that the standard identifies both general requirements and specific requirements for the implementation of control measures. National level risk assessments also may include specific control measures. So when the national level risk assessment for the United States is approved, it's possible that it will include or mandate specific control measures to be implemented. The requirements embedded within section 4 for risk mitigation are numerous, and those listed on this slide are just a few. So we encourage you to review section 4 to understand the full requirements and corresponding details. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the FSC webinar conducted earlier in May is a good source of information for specific requirements related to the implementation of risk mitigation and control measures. It's identified on the FSC page noted earlier as Module 4, Risk Mitigation. Regardless, we'll mention a few basic requirements here, but before I do so, let me point out that risk mitigation and the corresponding control measures do not necessarily represent a key difference between the old and new standards, as Annex 3 of the old standard effectively served as the risk mitigation element in version 2-1. The very first requirement of this section is to have and implement control measures at both the origin and supply chain levels. The certificate holder is required to clearly state the desired outcome of each control measure. Also, where adequate control measures may conflict with legal requirements, alternative control measures will need to be approved by the certification body. When establishing control measures, certificate holders are required to use the approved controlled wood documents in the FSC procedure indicated here. certificate holders may use indicators and verifiers in an approved Forest Stewardship National Standard or International Generic Indicators. As I mentioned earlier, these are just a few basic requirements for risk mitigation. Please review the standard and the FSC resources available for more detail about these requirements if you are sourcing from an area that is not low risk or if you identify any risk of mixing within your supply chain. Okay, so this slide provides a few examples of the types of control measures that may be implemented at the origin and/or supply chain. So hopefully this will address the question that I see that came up in the chat most recently. The examples listed here are actually drawn directly from Annex E of the standard. Stakeholder consultation, expert engagement, and document verification were mentioned earlier in the presentation. They may not only serve as control measures, but may also serve as a means to identify relevant changes to your DDS. Note that specific requirements are identified for both stakeholder consultation and expert engagement. Supply chain audits may serve as a control measure to mitigate risk at the supply chain level, and field verifications may be conducted at the Forest Management Unit or at any of the suppliers along the supply chain. Certificate holders may also use third-party verification, material testing, legally binding agreements, and/or supplier training and capacity building as control measures. Finally, certificate holders may simply exclude certain suppliers altogether from their controlled wood program. Again, these are examples only and are drawn directly from the new controlled wood standard itself. Additionally, specific examples of the implementation of control measures are found in Annex E of the standard, as well as in FSC's webinar, Module 4, Risk Mitigation. Control measures, like risk assessments and information gathering, are necessary at both the origin and supply chain levels. To meet compliance with the standard then, you'll have to develop, implement, and document your control measures where necessary. We recommend that you periodically check for updates on the FSC risk assessment database so that you can be informed of any changes that will affect your DDS and consequently the corresponding control measures implemented at the origin level. Besides developing and implementing your control measures at both the origin and supply chain levels, remember to also state the desired outcome of each control measure and obtain any necessary approval from SCS. Annexes B, C, and E of the standard serve as important resources on the different types of control measures that may be used, as well as specific requirements for certain control measures such as stakeholder consultation and expert engagement. Let me emphasize that while there are some specific requirements related to control measures mandated by the standard and/or specific national level risk assessments, the standard is largely non-prescriptive and allows for a high degree of flexibility in how certificate holders choose to implement control measures. Again, this is because each certificate holder is unique with different sources of origin and different supply chains. What control measures you implement will actually depend on a variety of factors, including the origin of the material and the corresponding categories identified as specified risk, the depth and breadth of your supply chain, and the nature, likelihood, and/or severity of the risk identified, for example. And again, as always, to reiterate, remember to document your control measures. Now let's have a quick discussion about the requirements for publicly available information, which have been significantly augmented with version 3 of the standard. The requirements for publicly available information correspond to Section 6 of the new standard. This table summarizes the requirements for publicly available information. The new standard specifies information required for all public summaries, as well as information required for those areas not designated as low risk at the origin level. All public summaries will need to include a description of the supply areas and the corresponding risk, a reference to the applicable FSC risk assessment, the organization's own risk assessment, the procedure for filing complaints, and contact information. For material sourced from areas not designated as low risk at the origin level, public summaries will also need to include the control measures implemented by indicator, a summary of the stakeholder consultation process where applicable, information about any experts used for the development of control measures, a summary of the findings of any field verifications conducted as control measures, and the steps taken by the certificate holder to address any non-conformances identified. This information will go on the certificate holder's public FSC profile. Much of the publicly available information was already required in the old controlled wood standard. What is new is the reference to the applicable FSC risk assessment, the procedure for filing complaints, and the risk mitigation information. Here's an example summary page of the publicly available information required by the standard. SCS, it's worth mentioning, is currently in the process of developing potential templates that you may use to help capture the necessary information required by the standard. When and as those become available, we'll be sure to inform you. In the meantime, this slide is merely a fictitious example intended to serve as a visual aid. Note that it references other tables or information which provide more detail, and examples of those additional tables and the additional information is captured on the next few slides. On this slide, for example, is a table that identifies a certificate holder's supply areas and their respective risk designations at the origin level. You'll note that in this fictitious example, specified risk is identified for both supply areas for categories 2 and 3. Again, this slide is intended merely to provide a visual aid for understanding what the public information requirements are and how they may be documented. And here's a table that identifies the corresponding control measures implemented at the origin level for one of the supply areas. Finally, this table provides the required information about experts. To reiterate, these last few slides are only intended to provide a visual aid for understanding what is necessary to meet compliance. Each individual certificate holder may develop its own way of gathering, assembling, documenting, and maintaining this information. The next two slides summarize the main priorities for each certificate holder transitioning to version 3 of the FSC controlled wood standard. Besides making a decision about your next audit, reviewing the resources already available from FSC, and learning the new terminology, each certificate holder will need to conduct and document annual internal audits, obtain and document the required information on controlled material, and map its supply chains. Additionally, certificate holders will have to conduct and document risk assessments. This includes updating your simplified risk assessment and developing and documenting your supply chain risk assessment. Where necessary, you will also need to implement and document the corresponding control measures. Remember that this applies at both the origin and supply chain levels. Implementing and documenting your control measures will also require you to state the desired outcome of each control measure, obtain any necessary approvals from SCS, and use Annexes B, C, and E as resources and guidance. Once all of these pieces are in place, you will need to prepare and document the publicly available information required by the standard. And finally, remember to prepare for a transition to an extended or national level risk assessment by December 31st, 2017, as simplified risk assessments are only temporary. Okay, so that concludes the content portion of our webinar. We'll now take questions and try to answer them as effectively as possible. Remember to submit your questions in the chat box and we'll try to answer them in the order that they were received. We're going to try to respect the time limit established for the webinar, so if questions remain, just be sure to follow up directly with your technical associate.